She tried to undermine him on live TV. His response? It changed everything. The email arrived late in the afternoon, a brief, formal invitation from the producers of The Morning Showdown, one of the top-rated talk shows in the country. They wanted Marcus Fields, CEO of the innovative tech company Qantas, to be a guest on their upcoming segment about diversity in the corporate world. Marcus had seen this act before, the mainstream media outlet suddenly remembering that black entrepreneurs exist, parading them for a quick applause before moving on to the next trending headline. But this felt different. Qantas wasn't just any startup. They had recently secured a massive government contract in cybersecurity, beating out some of the biggest tech companies in the game. That success wasn't a fluke. It was the result of over 2 decades of dedication and hard work. Still, Marcus hesitated before agreeing. Something about the timing felt off. His assistant Julia immediately sensed his reluctance. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked. "You know how these shows operate. They love the success story, but they love tearing it down even more." Marcus leaned back in his office chair, deep in thought. "I'll handle it. Besides, it's national exposure. Let's see what they have to say." Julia shook her head. "Just don't let them bait you into their game." He nodded, knowing full well the challenge ahead. If this interview was a setup, they had picked the wrong man to play with. The morning of the interview, Marcus arrived at the KJX studios in New York City. The green room felt cold, sterile, and transactional. A young producer barely looked up from her clipboard as she greeted him. "Mr. Fields, thanks for being here. We'll mic you up in 5, she said flatly. No pleasantries, no small talk, just another scheduled segment. As Marcus sat in the makeup chair, the assistant powdered his face, her motions mechanical. A monitor on the wall showed a live broadcast of the show, a celebrity gossip segment, followed by a cooking demo. Then a transition card. Up next, the Black Tech Surge. Is it talent or a special advantage? Marcus clenched his jaw. So this was the angle they'd chosen. If they thought he would be intimidated, they were in for a surprise. The set of The Morning Showdown was designed to appear welcoming. Soft blues and golds with a sleek glass coffee table between the host's chair and the guests. Cameras circled like silent vultures capturing every movement. Marcus adjusted his blazer before taking a seat across from Ava Mitchell, the lead anchor, a seasoned journalist known for asking hard-hitting questions. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Marcus Fields," she began, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "CEO of Qantas, a true success story in the tech industry." Marcus gave a polite nod. "Thanks for having me." Ava leaned in slightly, flipping through her cue cards. "Let's dive in. Your company recently landed a $150 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in tech. Impressive, to say the least." Marcus knew this dance. Build him up first, make it seem like they respected his success, before taking a sharp turn. He offered a measured response. "It was a long process, but yeah, we put in the work. We developed a cybersecurity system that outperformed the competition. Simple as that." Ava shifted in her seat, crossing her legs. "Some have called it groundbreaking," she said, then added, "but others argue that Qantas benefited from specific government diversity programs, that these contracts were awarded in part because of a diversity quota, and not necessarily because your company was the best choice." There it was. The real reason he was here? Marcus let a moment pass before answering. "I've heard that argument before. It's funny, though. When a black entrepreneur wins, it's called special treatment. But when legacy firms run by the same families for generations land those contracts, nobody asks if it's about diversity. Why is that?" The room shifted. Ava's eyes widened, and the producers behind the cameras exchanged glances. Marcus could feel the tension building. Ava held her ground. "So, you're saying race didn't play a role in your success at all?" Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. Let me ask you this. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos secured government deals for Blue Origin, was it because of his background? Or do we only ask those questions when the CEO looks like me? The studio fell silent, all eyes locked on Marcus. Ava's practiced composure faltered as she tried to recover from the punch he just landed. Ava Mitchell's expression barely flickered. So you don't believe these diversity programs help? Marcus Fields folded his hands. They help level the playing field, but what people don't realize is the playing field was never leveled to begin with. But Ava wasn't done yet. She had something else up her sleeve. Her smile sharpened, like a blade hidden in silk. She glanced at her cue cards, then back up at Marcus. Well, Marcus, let's talk about that playing field you mentioned, she said, her tone shifting from polite curiosity to something a little colder. You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama? Single mother, public school, worked your way up from nothing. That's inspiring. Marcus gave a slow nod, sensing where this was going. Ava continued, but here's what some might wonder. How does someone with no Ivy League background, no deep family connections, go from a struggling neighborhood to securing contracts that billion-dollar corporations fail to land? She let the question hang in the air. How did you get here? Did someone pull strings? Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words carefully. It's called work, Ava. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on. So we build from the ground up. Ava gave a small nod like she was hearing him but not listening. But surely you had help along the way, she pressed. Maybe a mentor, a program, something that gave you an extra push? Marcus exhaled quietly. Yeah, help came in the form of working 3 jobs while getting my engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my office while I built my first software prototype because I couldn't afford rent. That's the help I got. Her lips pressed together for a fraction of a second. The producers standing behind the cameras were locked in now. Ava shuffled her cue cards again. And yet some would argue that Black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before, that programs like affirmative action, minority business grants, and government incentives exist specifically to open doors that weren't open decades ago. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. You know what's funny? When a Black business owner succeeds, people always ask what programs helped us. But nobody asks which old money bank helped fund a white-owned startup. Nobody asks which family connections got them into Stanford, or which golf buddy invested in their company. He let that sink in for a second before continuing. The truth is, success isn't handed out in some lottery. People like me had to be twice as good just to get a seat at the table. A noticeable shift in the room, the quiet tension of an audience realizing they were watching something real unfold. Ava, however, didn't blink. Instead, she smiled the way a chess player smiles when they think they've just cornered their opponent. It's an interesting perspective, she said, voice smooth as glass. But let's address another factor, perception. She turned slightly toward the cameras. Marcus, you present yourself as a self-made success, but let's talk about the public perception of your story. Some say that Black entrepreneurs get an unfair advantage when it comes to media attention, that the narrative of overcoming struggle is more marketable than the thousands of white business owners who work just as hard but don't get the same headlines. Marcus let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, so now we get too much attention? Ava kept her polished smile, but a slight shift in her posture gave her away. She wasn't expecting him to laugh. You're telling me that in a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where major tech funding still overwhelmingly goes to white-owned startups, the real issue is that people like me get too much press? Ava tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I'm just pointing out that in today's climate, some people feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. Merit? Right. He glanced briefly at the cameras, then back at her. "Let me ask you something, Ava. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now?" Her lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, he kept going. "You think I got here because I played the diversity card, or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out?" The silence in the room was louder than any of her previous questions, but Ava wasn't done. Not yet. Because she had one last card to play, the one designed to break him. Ava took a slow breath, shifting in her seat just enough to make it look casual. But Marcus saw it, a crack in the facade. She glanced at her cue cards again, then set them down. "Marcus," she said, tilting her head slightly. The interview went viral too, further solidifying Marcus Fields as a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. But for him, the true reward came closer to home. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to before started greeting him warmly in the hallways, offering kind words and genuine smiles. Eleanor, the neighbor who had stood up for him, became a regular visitor to his apartment, often bringing over baked goods and stories from her long life. As the dust settled, the incident became a catalyst for change, not just at Magnolia Creek, but in the broader conversation about how we treat one another. Weeks after the poolside incident, life at Magnolia Creek felt different. The community had shifted, and the tension that once lingered between residents seemed to dissipate. People began to see one another differently, not as strangers to be judged, but as neighbors sharing the same space, each with their own stories and struggles. Marcus noticed the change every time he walked through the complex. Neighbors he'd never spoken to before stopped him for small conversations or offered a friendly wave. Children played freely in the courtyard without their parents watching anxiously from the sidelines. It felt like the walls of suspicion and isolation had started to crumble, brick by brick. As for Ava, her reputation within the complex was tarnished. Though she hadn't been evicted, she kept a low profile, avoiding the common areas and walking quickly whenever she passed others. Rumors swirled that she was considering moving, but nothing was confirmed. What was clear was that the incident had forced her to confront her behavior. Whether or not she would change was a question only time could answer. Marcus, meanwhile, took the lessons he'd learned and turned them into action. With encouragement from Eleanor and other supportive neighbors, he organized a community event at the complex, a barbecue open to all residents. The goal was simple: to foster connection and understanding among people who might never otherwise interact. The turnout was better than anyone expected. Families brought homemade dishes, kids played games, and conversations flowed freely. Eleanor sat in a corner chatting with a group of younger residents, her laughter ringing out over the sound of music and chatter. Marcus worked the grill, flipping burgers and handing out plates, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment he hadn't expected. By the end of the night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood on the patio and looked out over the gathering. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, conversations to be had, and barriers to break down. But it was a start. For the first time in a long time, the community felt like a place where people truly belonged. When the crowd began to thin out, Eleanor approached Marcus with a plate of cookies. "You've done something really special here," she said warmly. "I hope you know that." Marcus smiled, accepting the plate. "I couldn't have done it without you, Eleanor. You were the first one to speak up." She waved him off with a laugh. "Well, somebody had to. But you turned it into something bigger, something meaningful." As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. What started as a moment of humiliation and frustration had grown into an opportunity for growth and understanding. Not just for him, but for everyone involved. The viral video eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by the next trending story. But the lessons it carried remained. Marcus's actions, Eleanor's courage, and the community's response had sparked a ripple effect that extended far beyond the gates of Magnolia Creek. The story of Magnolia Creek reminds us that standing up against prejudice isn't just about confrontation. It's about building bridges, creating dialogue, and fostering spaces where everyone feels safe and valued. Small actions can lead to big changes, but it all starts with the courage to say, "This isn't right." The hour some called him brave, others called him angry and combative. By lunchtime, the Morning Exchange released a carefully worded statement. "We value open dialogue and diverse perspectives. While today's discussion became more intense than expected, we stand by our commitment to fair conversations." Marcus laughed when he read it. Fair, right? His assistant Tasha called him, her voice half laughing, half exasperated. "Do you realize you just set the internet on fire?" Marcus rubbed his temple. "It wasn't exactly my plan." "Well, congrats, you just became the most talked about entrepreneur in America." He didn't respond. He knew what came next because viral moments don't stay just moments. They become battlegrounds. The next 48 hours were about to get messy. But this wasn't just about him anymore. By the next morning, the story had exploded beyond social media. Cable news anchors debated it on live television. Opinion pieces flooded every major publication. Everyone had an angle. Fox News: "Is Marcus Fields the new face of corporate entitlement?" CNN: "Marcus Fields' viral moment, a reckoning for America's meritocracy." Business Insider: "What Marcus Fields' interview reveals about race and success in America." Meanwhile, Ava Mitchell was in damage control mode. On her show the next morning, she gave a carefully rehearsed response. "I respect Mr. Fields and his accomplishments, but I stand by my questions. My job as a journalist is to ask what the audience is thinking. If my questions were uncomfortable, that only proves how necessary they were." Translation: she wasn't backing down. Marcus watched from his office, shaking his head. Tasha sat across from him, scrolling through emails. "You know," she said, "we just got a flood of new investor inquiries. People want to work with us." Marcus smirked. "Let me guess, the same people who ignored us last year?" Tasha shrugged. "Guess being controversial is good for business." But it wasn't all positive. Some clients pulled out, a major corporate partner suddenly decided to reevaluate their commitments, and then came the death threats. Emails, phone calls, even an unmarked package left outside Innova's headquarters. Nothing inside, but a single sheet of paper with one word written in bold: "Enough." Tasha frowned as she read the message. "You need security." Marcus let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He knew this would come. Anytime a black man speaks too boldly, too unapologetically, this is the cost. But backing down was never an option. Now he had a decision to make. Would he let the backlash silence him, or was this just the beginning of something bigger? Marcus sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind: praise, backlash, threats, opportunities. He thought about his younger self, the kid from Birmingham who had to fight for every inch of success, the one who watched doors shut in his face while others walked through without knocking. And now here he was, at the center of a national debate he never asked for, but couldn't ignore. Tasha entered, her expression unreadable. "We just got an offer." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "From who?" She set a folder on his desk. "A network. They want you to do a televised special, a one-on-one deep dive about race, business, and the system." Marcus exhaled. "So now they want to listen?" Tasha smirked. "Seems like it." Then, after a beat, she asked, "What do you want to do?" He leaned back in his chair, thinking. He could walk away, let the noise die down, get back to business. Or he could use this moment. Not for clout, not for attention, but to say the things nobody wanted to hear. Marcus picked up the folder, flipping through the proposal. Then he set it down. He looked at Tasha. "Tell them I'll do it." Her eyes widened slightly. "You sure?" He nodded. "Yeah, but on my terms. Because if the system was going to put me under a spotlight, I was damn sure going to control the narrative." Marcus Field's viral moment wasn't just another internet controversy, it was a reckoning. It forced a conversation people had been dodging for decades, about race, about success, about who gets to rise without question and who gets questioned when they rise. Some called him an activist, some called him arrogant, some called him right. But one thing was certain, nobody could ignore him anymore. So, what do you think? Does success mean playing by the rules of a broken system? Or does it mean rewriting the rules entirely? Let us know in the comments, and if you believe more stories like this need to be told, subscribe.